nobody wants to hear you're having email problems because your content is not good, right? But I feel
Exactly.
like a lot of times that is it, right?
Hmm.
Google just understands that this is a promotional email.
Hmm.
And I think that area of the whole game is so nuanced, but
Hmm.
people who understand what's going to land you in promotion versus not are the ones that are masters of email copy. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the High Level Spotlight Sessions, where we showcase awesome marketers doing awesome marketing. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Matt Ratliff. He's the creator and founder of Funnel Techie, an elite email academy. In addition to being an extremely well-rounded technical person, I would say, he works alongside his wife, Grace, in their home in East Tennessee, where they provide email deliverability services to businesses and agencies alike. Correct, Matt?
That is correct. You nailed
Thanks
it.
for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. This is awesome.
I'm assuming it's going to be a good conversation. I love geeking out with folks. And from what I understand, your ability to geek out is at a higher level than most. You spent years as a networking engineer. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's my bread and butter. I came from a networking background, so designing networks literally all across the US, across the globe, and that's my foundation.
Very cool. So I could see how that lends itself nicely to email and helping folks with deliverability type of issues, because email is in that layer of the internet that none of us understand.
Well, yeah, well, not to mention early in my career, I used to develop Linux email servers. So I used to build those for mom and pops, and that grew. And then eventually that led into Microsoft Exchange boxes back in the day, where you would have to build your own on-premise type setups. So that's really where a lot of that knowledge came from.
Why is email so confusing? Like, I've been doing this for, I don't know, over a decade, coming up on 2, and I barely understand like MX records. Okay, MX records make email work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we can get super technical. So let's start the very high level portion of it. Email can be very difficult, but whenever you're in an ESP, doesn't matter if you're with, Mailgun, SendGrid, Postmark, it doesn't matter. They're going to tell you exactly what to kind of put in as far as your DNS records.
Mhm.
Even if from like an organizational domain perspective, like funneltechie.com, that's an organizational domain, it's the root level. If you were to put that in Google G Suite or Office 365, they're going to tell you exactly which records to put in. So MX records are basically, if I were to send you an email to your domain, well, I would have to find your MX record so that I know exactly where that envelope is going. So it's really, creating a path through the internet to know exactly where that needs to land. And so that's one aspect. And then of course, SPF records, DKIM or domain authentication, and the whole DMARC stuff, right? We can get super deep with this, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you kind of covered, I guess what I would say is where I feel like a lot of people stumble in the very beginning, which is typically when you use high level and you're going to go set up email for someone, let's say a client or your own agency sub account, you hop into your domain registrar and you navigate to the DNS and you're like, wait a minute. It's telling me to enter MX records, but there are already MX records in here.
Yes.
Right. And they're typically at the root. And what we're going to do are subdomains. So talk to us about the difference between the two.
So there's so something to keep in mind whenever you're kind of building your email foundation. Your organizational domain is your root domain. So that's going to typically live, like I just mentioned, Google G Suite, Office 365. Now, when you get into a business aspect, you've got transactional based email flows. If someone comes into your world, makes a purchase of a product or service that you have, that next email is very critical that it gets sent and that the client receives it. So that's going to be transactional in nature. So typically that should be on its own subdomain. So in my world, that would be t.funneltechie.com. So it's transactional. And you're going to have the highest deliverability among that because everyone's going to open those emails because it's expected. Now, for marketing or promotional emails, that also needs to be on its own email flow, which would account for a new subdomain. And typically it doesn't matter the subdomain name. You just have to identify that it's for this particular purpose. So again, going back to that same example, m.funneltechie.com is typically what I use. So M stands for marketing, just something super simple. So I think just that clarification is not something that everyone knows about. And so it's super critical. And then that also comes down to kind of like your domain reputation. So let's say, for example, if you've combined transactional with marketing, that's okay to a degree. But at some point, as you continue to grow, eventually you're going to have a lot of people that are going to begin, hitting the spam complaint button, right? Marking your messages as spam. That could eventually hurt the transactional sends that you're mixing in with that. So that's a piece to be very mindful of. And we can talk about some things that I hope that high level will go toward as a mechanism to kind of get around it. And there's already something that I do currently for that piece, but we can get into that in just a moment.
I was going to say, are you actually using 2 sub accounts for your business? Because one is just
2 sub accounts.
Notifications and the other is marketing.
Yep, exactly. So two locations. So one dedicated for transactional. So that location will have all my front end funnels, my websites, where you could go make a purchase of my products, my services. And so that's the transactional. And then I've got, if you've ever used Integromat, which is now called Make, I use that as a very simple automation, which anytime that someone comes in through my transactional will automatically be synced to my marketing subdomain. It's very clean, very easy. And so that's how I do it.
That's interesting. So I could see you saying at some point, well, maybe even at like the workflow level, being able to choose which sending subdomain is going to operate.
Yeah. And I would imagine, not that it would not be, I'm sure there's some complexity on the high level side to do it, but like within a workflow, seems like there's room enough for us to kind of choose which is the intended purpose. And so if we had that built-in functionality, that is almost a game changer for so many people.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I'll definitely pass this interview along to the email team
Thank you
for their consideration, but that's interesting. So that kind of makes sense to me. One question I always like to ask, because I always forget the answer to it. If my real email's on my root domain, right?
Yep.
chasebuckner.com, let's say. I set up a sending subdomain and it's like m.chasebuckner.com. And I go do a bunch of really sleazy cold outreach spam on that subdomain.
Yep.
Can I harm the scores, the trust or whatever of my root domain, or is it that only happens the other way around? The root can harm the subs.
That's there's a little bit of data to show that can happen. It depends on the severity of it. Like if I think that there's more data to dig into, but I think that there is some causation of that happening, but it has to be at a very high level. The kind of the way that I teach some of this to a lot of my clients, a lot of the agency clients that I've got, is that, they got a generic root domain and they're creating unique subdomains for each of their clients that they're onboarding. And so that kind of fits in kind of what you mentioned just now. We wouldn't want to use some sort of production root domain that would affect the root. We want to stay away from that typically, but from what I've seen, that doesn't impact the root to a degree, but I would imagine the more data that we had on that, the more I would know for a fact, but I don't see a lot of that. But I think once we reach a certain threshold, I'm sure that does come into play.
That sounds about what I recall. And I think the reverse is true, that if you were to go spam on your root domain, no matter what subdomain
it's going to bleed up.
It's going to bleed up.
Yeah.
So as a best practice, let's cover this real quick, because I think brand new high-level user might go, hopefully not, set up their MX records for their root domain. Let's say they set up one sending subdomain and it's m.chasebuckner.com. Okay. The kind of lazy path is to then just use that for all of my sub accounts.
Yes.
And so basically all of my clients' mail is going out through the same subdomain, which is a bad idea, right?
It is a bad idea, and I can explain it. The reason that's a bad idea, especially if you're using Mailgun has established these acceptable use policies. So I think it's 5% for bounces, 1.4% for unsubscribes, and then 0.08% for spam complaint rates. So if at any point, let's say hypothetically speaking, you've got 50 sub accounts and everything's been going great until this last 50th client has been onboarded, and that's the bad apple. And they buy a cold email list, and then all of a sudden you see all of these warnings coming from Mailgun. And then what happens is that single subdomain that's being used among all 50 of your clients, if it reaches any of those acceptable use policies, Mailgun will instantly shut off that domain. And so it affects all 50 of your sub accounts. So that's why that happens. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So I'll call that tier 1. So that's tier 1. It's the easiest, the quickest. Tier 2 would be if you have a sophisticated automation, which I have built in Make, which is very cool. For anyone that's coming on board, you would use a generic sending domain, but then create a unique subdomain for every client coming on board. And that's a model that I've deployed a lot of, and that works quite well. So in that same scenario, it's only going to affect that one account. But
so are you saying that you're automating a new subdomain off of your agency domain?
yeah,
Right?
as long as it's a generic one, yes. So whatever the organizational generic email sending domain that you've established, yeah, exactly.
So let me paint that picture a little more clear if I can.
Okay.
My company is chasebuckner.com, but I'm going into SaaS mode. So I'm going to get chasebuckner.net to do my transactional email. And then every client I get, I'm automatically spinning up a client name .chasebuckner.net.
Essentially.
So that they're all sending on their own siloed subdomain. So if that 50th bad apple comes on board, he's only going to flame out his specific subdomain. The rest of my clients, their mail continues to deliver.
Exactly. And plus, with that model, you get isolated email stats per client. So if a client ever comes to the agency owner and says, hey, man, my emails are going to spam. Can you help me out? Well, let's take a look.
And
so
then
you can pull those.
And to do that, I'm assuming you have to use something like Cloudflare where you can API create subdomains, right?
Exactly. So Cloudflare is that prerequisite.
Cool.
Yep. And
That's
it works.
nice.
It works really well. The other thing is that people aren't quite privy to it, but you can't quite create certificates with Mailgun using their API system. So Cloudflare has also that ability to create those certificates to fill that gap, which is a requirement for TLS.
And certificate has to do with a DKIM or one of those type of records?
You know, whenever you're inside of Mailgun, do you remember the CNAME tracking link that you have to put in? So in order for that to be coded correctly, in order for you to be able to track it correctly, there is a certificate that has to be generated for it. So for whatever reason, Mailgun, the web schema that plays into that aspect, they always set it to HTTP. And so if you leave it set to that, that's going to cause the broken link scenario, which then is going to have a negative impact on your domain's reputation. So it's critical that everyone is aware of that piece and make sure that everyone turns it to HTTPS so that a certificate can be generated. And so that anytime that you embed a link in your email sends, the contact that clicks on it doesn't see a broken link. It goes straight to the site that it's supposed to, and it's trackable. But going back to the automation, Cloudflare can actually create that certificate for that function.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I feel like I should jump in at this point and say a lot of what we're talking about is why we launched Lead Connector, to make a lot of this more easy to manage so that, you don't have to deal with this yourself. But there's always going to be the power users that want full control. And with full control, you can usually go even deeper, right? And achieve, stellar top of industry sort of deliverability type of rates. And so I'm assuming you're going to say T3 is sending domain specific to the client.
Exactly. Full custom domains. Yeah. That's kind of where everyone needs to get to. And even if you're the agency owner, and let's say for example, if you're taking the privilege, I guess, of creating those custom domains for the clients, that you can still do that, still give them kind of their isolated stats. So yeah, you can certainly do that as well. It could be in the sub account owner's own account or under the agencies, but yeah.
Right. And that just requires us getting access to our client's DNS.
Exactly, which is not a lot of agencies want to do that because, there's a two-factor authentication, getting the credentials, it takes a little bit longer. So a lot of agencies tend to want to keep it in under their own umbrella just because it's quicker.
And this is an interesting conversation. Is it, I can't remember. So like Google Business Profile, right? Like if you're my client, I could send you instructions to share access to that with my Google Business Agency account or whatever. Can you do that with Cloudflare, Google Domains, where you can just share access so you don't have to like send me your logins?
Yeah, you can delegate access, and it works really well. Yeah, so that's an easy method. That's what I basically tell my clients to do. That's the easiest way.
Now, if you want to take it one step further, which I used to do because I wanted to really get embedded with my clients for the long term, was have them actually point their name servers where I wanted to my Cloudflare, so that I had control of the DNS. Explain the difference of what I just described.
So you're saying you're wanting the client to point their domain to your DNS.
Their name servers to my Cloudflare is what I would do.
Yep. So basically what you're saying is that since they've done that within their own registrar, now you can take that root domain, add it in your Cloudflare account, and then you've got complete control over it. But of course, you would have to go into Cloudflare, add the domain, and then give them the name servers so that they could put it in the registrar. Yeah.
Right. And I always thought it was interesting because on the one hand, it was great because it prevented them being able to stumble in there and mess something up.
Exactly.
On the flip side, anytime anything needed to happen in the domain, they had to come to me, right? So there's plus and minuses with that. But most businesses have no problem with it because they're so confused by it. And they're like, oh, that's great. Like I can just pass it to you. But I always thought that was interesting. There must be a difference between a registrar and a DNS, and the NS record is what determines where that lives, right?
Yeah, the name server. Yeah, so you can register a domain, quite anywhere. You can even do it inside of Cloudflare if you wanted to. So that becomes the registrar. But typically, the registrar always has name servers that you can become a part of. But if you've got the ability to move to Cloudflare on a name server perspective, that's just going to be better overall, not just for email, but also for your website.
Cool. So let's dig into deliverability, right? The goal of all of this is that when we send an email, the end user sees it, right? It lands in their inbox and that they open it, read it, and don't take a negative action, right? Don't flag it as spam. So in order for that to happen, how many things have to happen before that?
Well, there's a few things. So let's start the very beginning. So let's go from the perspective of creating a Mailgun subdomain. So instantly you create that Mailgun subdomain. Mailgun is going to make you a part of the shared pool of IPs, which they give you 2 of, and you don't know what pool of IPs you're in. Okay, that's the first thing. The reason I say it like that is because it could be, so those shared IPs are going to be shared by a ton of other folks, and you don't know if there's any bad apples there. So in order to get some data out of it, the very first thing would be to maybe send some test emails out to some Gmail inboxes, maybe Outlook and Yahoo, just to kind of see where things land. So it's possible that maybe one of those inbox providers, the history that they have on that sending IP, maybe it's not favorable. And so first of all, we need to check the reputation if we can. So that's one thing. And then also, it could be on a significant block list, and not every block list is the same. There's only a handful of ones to pay attention to, but it's things like that. So I tell folks that the IP is what reigns king in the very beginning. That's how you're going to get into the world of landing in the inbox. So we need to check that first. And then continue.
Can you explain? So and I'm only asking you this question because I know that you know all this stuff.
Okay.
IP addresses, I feel like, are very confusing to folks, right? So myself included, right? Okay. I envision it as like this box and it can hold X amount of sending domains.
Okay. So what happens is that these ESPs, service providers, they've purchased a block of IPs. And so just imagine kind of in a data center, all of these servers, right? And sitting in a cluster. And so they take the gauntlet of, sending out of email. So any one of those could be assigned a particular IP that Mailgun has given you for this domain that you've created. So what happens is that whenever you click the send button from GHL, that initiates a call over to Mailgun. And then Mailgun, being the SMTP envelope sender, will then initiate the send. So they're sending the envelope, the actual email. And so that it's coming out of a server someplace, which then there has to be an IP address that gets associated with it. And so that's how that works. So it's all virtualized, but that IP lives within Mailgun and not from your own workstation. Some people come to me and say, can I use a VPN to get a different IP? Well, no, it doesn't work that way. It's all coming from Mailgun. So Mailgun is the provider for that piece.
Yeah, and I always thought that was just interesting. It's like it can't just all happen through a domain. There's like this bigger level called an IP address, and it can only hold X amount of domains, and then you'd have to go to another IP.
To a degree. So if, for example, if we're talking about kind of the whole reputational thing too, I don't know how many IPs Mailgun would own. It's thousands upon thousands. So you can go look at their ranges that they've got through INET, or I forget the entity now. Anyway, you can look that up, and they're going to have a ton of them. So anytime that you need to rotate those IPs out for any given reason, then of course they'll be able to, as long as you prove that it's been added to some block list. But yeah, everything on the internet has to have a public IP to be routable.
Right. So you brought up a good point. So if you do find out that right out of the gate, your mail's not making it where you want it to go, you can go back to Mailgun or to us, and we can go to Mail if you're on Lead Connector and request to be shifted to a different IP address. And most of the time there's no problem that they do that, right?
Yeah, exactly. But definitively, like if you go and use some system like Mail Genius or Mail Tester, I'm not a big fan of those systems, just because a lot of the times the data that they give you is wrong, especially from a block list perspective. In some situations, like even some of the SPF data they give you back is not always correct. So just be mindful of it.
So which ones do you like to use to find out if your IP is on a block list?
So I like to use Cisco Talos. So if you send yourself an email address, just establish a Gmail account, send yourself an email, and then within that, and I can even show you in a minute if you want to, you can go to the More button and look at the SPF record line, and that's going to show you the sending IP of that particular email. Then you can use that and go to Cisco Talos, which is a part of the dashboard that I'll show you too. It leads out to that and shows you kind of the reputational status that it sees as a whole. But at the very bottom, it's also going to show you the most significant block lists that are out there. And that's going to be Spam Cop. It's going to be Abuse at, Spam House or Hoss, however you pronounce it. And then the fourth one would be Barracuda, but Barracuda is typically used in corporate environments, and Cisco and Barracuda, they're competitors, so they're not going to list Barracuda. But those are primarily the ones to definitely be aware of. So if you're on any of those lists, then definitely work with Mailgun to get it delisted.
And when you talk about
more rotated,
when you talk about reputation, what is the score? Is it like 1 to 100? Is it like A through F? What are the levels of
this is all governed by the actual inbox providers. So it's going to be different. There's not a secret sauce for any one of them. Just know the pillars of what to look for is, the IP is what reigns king, and that holds a very large portion of whether or not you're going to get into the inbox or not. The second piece is your domain reputation. Google is trying to move more into domain reputation data more than IP, but they're not quite there yet. It would be great when one day we can solely just rely on domain reputation only. That would be awesome, because then, Microsoft with Outlook and MSN and Hotmail, they're sticklers for the IP. So if they've recorded some bad history on this given IP that you're sending email on, guess what? You're never going to get into the inbox. So,
and that makes sense, right? Because it's not fair, right? I have nothing to do with the person that was just sharing on the shared IP block.
Yeah, especially if you're just starting out, you've just created your business and you want to, start acquiring a list and you're on a set of shared IPs. You don't have any governance over that. So that's going to be problematic to some degree. However, I have noticed though that Mailgun within the last 6 months has done a better job of keeping up to date with how their IPs are viewed globally. And so I've seen a drastic change and I hope that continues. So that's a positive for most folks that are using Mailgun.
That's great. Now, you also learned that, wait a minute, I can buy a dedicated IP address, but I have been told that that actually can be a bad idea unless you're sending a certain amount of a certain high volume of email.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So the reason that let's talk about the reason it can be good. It gets you out of the whole mess of sharing an IP with someone else. So if you got complete control over your sends, and your audience, your contact list is very receptive to your emails, then you stand a better chance at landing in the inbox every single time. The reason that it can be bad is because most ESPs, email service providers, do have kind of an audit they have to go through in order to give you a dedicated. So Mailgun has it set at 100,000 emails per month. So if you meet that threshold, then okay, that's going to be great. And then from that perspective, there should be enough volume that you're sending emails on into each of the major inbox providers to kind of get a good reputation built up. However, let's say that you're only sending maybe 20,000 emails per month and you happen to have a dedicated IP. If you're able to get that, great. But if that's happening, you're gonna do more harm than good, because if you don't have a real good email cadence, you're not sending regularly, then that could reset the IP score that an inbox provider has seen from your IP. So at some point, it's going to meet a threshold, a dead timer, and it's going to reset the score. And now you're starting over again to rebuild that reputation. So you must keep that reputation up by sending more and more emails. So that's why Mailgun says 100,000 emails per month in order to get a dedicated. So in those instances, that's why.
Wow, that's interesting and kind of weird. I guess they consider when they see the drop in activity that this IP address is changing hands, and therefore we need to reset the grading system.
I don't know why they do it that way, to be honest, but I don't know even what that timeline is, because it's always shifting. I try my best to dig deep into this kind of stuff to try to pull that data out, but it's very difficult. So I don't know what that threshold is, or even the true reason why it's done. But yeah, that's something to be mindful of. So if you're going to go that route of a dedicated IP, be a high volume sender, first of all. If you can, I've gotten some clients where it made sense even at a 60K volume to get a dedicated, and working with Mailgun support, I'm able to do it, but it doesn't always happen. And you've got to do your due diligence to understand exactly where they're sending their emails to make sure that's a good fit. You can imagine if you've got, most, maybe 90% of your emails are going to Gmail users, but the other 10% might be going to Microsoft. Well, that may not be enough to fit into Microsoft's
only seeing a small amount.
So just be aware of those types of things.
Got it. Interesting. Okay, so we've got our sending subdomain set up. We know we're on a good IP. What happens from here that determines whether or not my emails are actually, there's deliverability and then there's delivered, right? These are different terms. So walk us through what the steps from here.
Totally different terms. So delivered just simply means, so if you're in Mailgun, you look at the stats, or even from high levels campaign stats, right? It shows you the percentage or the number of emails being delivered. All that means is that the inbox provider, Gmail, Outlook, Yahoo, has accepted the email and it landed someplace. You don't know where it landed. It could have landed in junk or spam. You don't really know. So deliverability and that's just a loose term, meaning that it landed in the inbox, and that's what we want. So whenever you're using these third-party systems that claim to say, yeah, your deliverability is this number, all that they're doing is using seed lists. These are inboxes that they use all the time to send, tests into. Those are decent tools, but Google especially is cracking down on these types of entities. So just be aware with those things and take it with a grain of salt, because it's not always clear cut either. But yeah, that's another component of it.
So do the ESPs, the Googles, the Microsofts of the world, do they not send back exactly where it landed?
Exactly. They do not. They're not going to do that. They're not going to tell you. No, they do not do that. The only true way to know is, when I teach kind of this game of understanding kind of where you're going, is that you want to do your own testing. Have some Gmail inboxes of your own, Outlook inboxes, and Yahoo inboxes. You create a brand new email campaign before you blast it to your audience. Send it to that test account that you've created yourself, and kind of see where things have landed. And that is just as good as any other platform out there that you would use in a third party fashion. But that way it would kind of tell you kind of what's happening. And from there, you can say, well, if it landed in promotions, that's good. It's not spam. It's actually the inbox is just a sorted version of the inbox, but they've identified that it's promotional in nature. And that tends to come back down to the copy, whether it be the subject line copy or the body copy. So if that happens, adjust the subject line first, send another series of emails, see where it lands. If nothing happens, then more than likely it's within the body copy. Make changes there and see where it lands. And typically you've found the problem.
That's cool. So I like that. I could envision having a smart list in high level that are the email accounts that I have access to. I send to that first, go see where it landed. You mentioned the promotions tab. I thought that was really interesting because I feel like nobody wants to hear you're having email problems because your content is not good, right?
Yeah,
but I feel like a lot of times that is it, right? Google just understands that this is a promotional email. And I think that area of the whole game is so nuanced, but people who understand what's going to land you in promotion versus not are the ones that are masters of email copy, I would say. It's a pretty fine line, right? Of landing on one side of the promotion or not.
It is, yeah. And it could just be just a couple of words even. Or it could be maybe a certain pattern within the footer, or even on that same note, going back to this whole footer section, a lot of people like to use a signature in the bottom of their emails. That's okay, guys. But I've seen that in a lot of situations that does tend to flip something in a direction that you don't want it to go. There's a particular pattern within that body, that message within the footer that contains your business logo, your telephone number, your social media links, something that these providers don't like, and that will cause your emails to go to spam. So that's another thing that I see a lot of that people aren't quite privy to. So yeah, so there's a lot to look into. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, we do that a lot when we're split testing emails. We'll always test one version that's just text only, no image, doesn't look very pretty, versus the really stylized newsletter style email. And it's always interesting to see how drastically different the results are.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of people, they get really caught up in thinking, well, if I use the term unsubscribe, so, if you're sending a promotional material, you got to adhere to the rules of CAN spam, right? So you must include a way or an opt-out form of some sort, or a way to opt out. So you can come up with whatever that is, but typically a lot of folks are just very used to including an unsubscribe link. And folks have gotten in their mind thinking that the word unsubscribe is automatically going to be a negative impact on your deliverability. And that is not so. That is not the case. I promise you. So make it
it's super the other easy way, right? It will increase your deliverability, won't it? If the carriers see that you're adhering by the rules.
You can. So yeah. So first of all, you want people to be able to unsubscribe very easily. That's what it comes down to. If they can't, if there's too much bottleneck, if there's too many steps for people to take, they're just going to make it easier on themselves, and they're just going to say right click and mark as spam. So we want to make it super easy for folks to unsubscribe, and that is a key. So stepping through like kind of these preferences and things like that, I'm not a big fan of. People have good success with it. I don't like it because it's too much for people to have to think through. So a one-click unsubscribe, if you can, is beneficial.
So that's interesting. Let me ask you what you think of what I prefer to do, because this is super interesting, right? So we launched Lead Connector email, and one of the top requests that we got right away was, we need the unsubscribe in the header, because that is going to improve deliverability. The carriers
list unsubscribe,
are saying it should be in the header where you can just unsubscribe right from the top. I never like that, because I feel like it's like a nuclear unsubscribe. where it's like everything versus I like to create smart lists and trigger links. So at the bottom of my emails, there's always two options. The first is don't want to receive whatever the cat like marketing emails from us anymore, unsubscribe here. And then below that, it'll say, don't want to receive anything from us ever again, unsubscribe here. Because oftentimes I relate to that, where it's like, I don't want your promotions, but I do want you to be able to email me if something's like really important and my account is broken or something like that.
Yeah.
Versus when you put it in the header, it's automatically all or nothing.
Yeah, exactly. So if you use the list unsubscribe header, which, LC can implement, or if you're on your own Mailgun account, you just have to include the unsubscribe tracking that's inside of the domain settings area. You can do that. I would prefer to handle that unsubscribe feature and just build it through high level instead. I don't really care about the list unsubscribe header, even though Mail Genius will say that it helps your deliverability. It doesn't really matter. As long as people have an easy way to unsubscribe, that's the key component, and that's all that matters.
That makes me feel better, because I always thought, I felt like there was this trade-off, and I don't know which way provides more benefit.
Yep. No, as long as people can easily unsubscribe, that's all that's required, and that's all that's needed. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, cool. So what are we, or have we missed anything along the way? I think we have, right? So we talked about the sending subdomain. We're making sure IP is clean. We talked about the messaging that's going to determine certain things, but then there are also other records that always confuse the heck out of me that play a big part in this, right?
Well, let's before we talk about that, let's talk about domain reputation.
Okay.
So we've spoken about IP. So now domain reputation, how do you know that? Well, there's tons of feedback loops out there. I'll call them feedback loops, but GPT, Google Postmaster tools, that's a real easy feedback loop system to become a part of. All you do, whatever you've got set in Mailgun, the subdomain that you've got created, go and add that to the subdomain or even the root domain, and then add any number of subs after the fact into Google Postmaster. As long as Google has seen 100 emails from your domain within the past 24 hours, they will give you data. The other prerequisite is that your domain has to be authenticated. And if you've set up SPF and DKIM, then you're authenticated. So that's always a given. But as long as you meet the threshold that Google needs to see, then they're going to give you data for that pinpoint for that day. So you can go there and look at the way they see your IP that you're sending from. They will give you your domain reputational data. They can even show you spam level of what they're detecting, of how their user base is taken to your messaging. You've got an ID on that. You can see delivery errors in case maybe the IP that you're using, if it's being deferred, meaning that for that 24-hour period, Google has received too many emails within a 24-hour period, and now they're going to defer it. Or if your reputation is so bad that they won't accept it. I've seen that lately. So you can get that really useful information out of those systems. With GPT, it's free. With Microsoft and Yahoo, it's free as well, but the prerequisite there is that you must have a dedicated IP in order to get into that system.
But wait, so how does that work? Do they give you an email address that you need to add to all of your lists, or how do they see all these emails?
Just talking about GPT.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so you've put in the email sending domain that you're wanting to grab data for. So whenever Google accepts your email from that sending domain, they've recorded it, and so they.
You mean so whenever Gmail across all of its users sees mail from that?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. And so, but that's very useful. And so if you see maybe your domain reputation is sitting at high, it will always begin high until Google gets a sense of how their user base, their Gmail users are taken to your messaging. Then it's going to fluctuate. So high, medium, low, and bad are the 4 categories for both IP and the domain reputation. So ideally, we always want to stay high as best as possible. But if we start to deviate from that, we can use the other tools that are built into GPT to figure out what's happening. And those components are the things that I love to teach, and, the ins and outs of all of this. I geek out on all of this stuff and enjoy teaching.
It's really interesting. It's sort of like a ethical privacy conundrum, right? It's basically Google saying, if you've got nothing to hide, show us everything, and we'll reward you for that. But if you don't show us everything, we might assume you've got something to hide.
To a degree. Now, they're not going to show you any information outside of what you're already using. So,
Mhm.
they're not going to show you the contacts that you're, sending messages to, or who's marking your messages as spam. I mean,
Sure.
you'll see that kind of stuff in the ESP, but not with Google Postmaster. But it's definitely useful though from an IP and a domain reputation standpoint.
I would imagine there's, some levers on the back end of Google that they pull when they're like, oh, they're in GPT. They've got nothing to hide. We've seen good signals from what's coming from them. Let's prioritize that and
Uh,
deprioritize people who are not on GPT because we don't really know what they're doing.
I've not seen that. That's a good thought. I've not seen any data that speaks to either side of that coin.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't think it
Fair
matters.
enough. Fair
Yeah,
enough.
there's some, like if you read forums and stuff about with Microsoft, there's a lot of stuff that says if you're part of SNDR with Microsoft, they sort of prioritize you in a sense, but I'd be very surprised if that's kind of what they're doing. I mean, I'm sure that Microsoft has been around a long time, so maybe they're still using some of the old tactics, but I don't think that's true. I've just not seen any data that says that's the case.
Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
Google may not be doing any evil. Okay.
Well, you never know.
Um,
You never know.
okay. So that sounds like an interesting thing. If I'm a legitimate business, I'm communicating with my customers, I'm running a newsletter, all that kind of
Mhm.
stuff, it sounds like I should probably register with GPT because why not?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. Like the first thing you do when you build an email domain, get into GPT. You've got to know how you stand.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So from there, are we ready to talk about the crazy ones yet? Because I feel like this is always where my mind starts to melt.
Yeah. So you mentioned records, right?
Mhm.
So yeah. So I assume that's kind of where your mind melts, maybe.
Mhm.
Well, so SPF and DKIM. So DKIM is the domain authentication. So those are two inherent pieces that you've got to have through Mailgun. So you put those pieces in and you get your domain verified. That's it. Now that's easy because you're given those pieces. DMARC is that extra piece that they don't tell you to do, but it's best practice to do it. Doesn't mean that it does not increase your deliverability. It's almost like taking the lid and putting it on the jar that's full of your security mechanisms. You're just, putting the cap on it. And now everything is totally secure with DMARC. So the way it works is that it protects you from any malicious activity. So if I wanted to spoof your chasebuckner.com domain or whatever you've got, I could do it if you don't have a DMARC policy. It would be quite easy to do it, but depending on how you've got things coded from an SPF level, like, at the very end, you've got kind of this tilde all. The tilde is a soft fail mechanism. So I can get around that. It doesn't matter. So if I claim to be sending email and it doesn't match kind of what SPF is saying to the inbox provider of what should be there, then they're going to say, well, they're just going to mark it, but they're going to allow the email to come on through. DKIM doesn't protect you in that manner. It protects the actual envelope send. So you send an email to someone, the path between you and them, as long as nothing's been changed in transmission of that message, then DKIM is going to come back and be valid. But if something's been altered in that transition, then we know that something's altered, and now DKIM is going to fail and the message will not go anywhere. It goes into dev null, goes into a black hole. DMARC is simply going to protect you from a domain level standpoint. So by the time that spoofed message reaches the endpoint, then what's going to happen is that the inbox provider is going to look at your SPF record. It's going to check that domain, compare it to, oh, you've got a DMARC policy published. Well, is the policy set to none, quarantine, or reject? If it's set to reject, that's what it should be. As long as you know what you're doing, there's a lot of things that go into that. So don't just willy-nilly do it. But as long as everything is matching, then everything's great. But if it doesn't, then that message is just not going to go anywhere, which is what you want to happen if your email has been spoofed. So it protects you from that mechanism and protects your domain, and it's not going to cause any degradation in your reputation. So that's how that is set up. But it doesn't inherently improve deliverability just because you have it.
Right.
Yep.
And I have heard and seen occasionally where you can really shoot yourself in the foot with that.
Oh, yes. Yeah, you can. Yeah, because the reason I'm glad you said that is because DMARC goes hand in hand with either the SPF record or DKIM. So it must have a domain match. So DMARC is derived from your header from field. So like when you're inside of high level, you're coding your from email line. So if you put, chase@chasebuckner.com, that is what's going to be used to extract the DMARC record from. So that's where that gets pulled. So if you don't have something in alignment there, or if you have it set to reject, then if you're sending that email through kind of an intermediary, like another subdomain through Mailgun, and there's not a match, if it's outside of that organizational domain, then it's going to fail. So in that situation, that policy needs to be set to none if that's how you're going to do it. But if the organizational domains match on both ends, then you typically are okay. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. So it's like, as a layman, it's cool and high level because you can go in and it's like sending from what name, what email, and you can put whatever you want. And you're like, I can put whatever I want. And it sends and it shows up that way.
Right.
DMARC would throw a wrench in that.
It's yeah. And I see a lot of agencies or clients, they're under an agency where, they're sending email through the generic agency sending domain through Mailgun, but they don't have a domain of their own yet, and they choose Gmail. And so right now you can get by with using, putting that as your from email line, and that message will be sent and it will be successfully sent and it'll go someplace. The reason that's the case is because Gmail has not created a DMARC reject policy. If you go and dig, it's actually there, but it's set to none. However, if you look, I think the same is true of Outlook. But if you look at Yahoo email addresses, then they've got it set to reject. So you can't send it in that fashion.
And that shoots you in the foot right away if you're trying to use one sending subdomain on your agency domain for all of your clients. They immediately then can't go send mail from @theirdomain.com in high level.
Well, you can, as long as that client doesn't have a restrictive DMARC policy set up for their root domain. And typically, a lot of people don't know to do it anyway. So for the mass majority of people, everyone's going to be okay unless you get some folks that think, oh, I need a DMARC reject policy, I'm just going to put it on there. Well, just be very careful with it.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. That's sort of my golden rule is like, when it comes to DMARC, I'm not going to do anything unless I'm doing it with an expert, because from, everything I've learned, it can go very wrong if you're not really careful about the specifics of the record that you're setting up. So
exactly.
I would talk to somebody like Matt if you are interested in taking that final step. I would consider it when we're talking about DNS records and email.
Thank you.
So have we covered everything there? Are we ready to get it to the more exciting stuff, like what you've built in this dashboard and all?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think enough of the tech stuff. Let's get into the fun stuff.
Yeah, let's do it. So talk to me about it. You went and built a dashboard because why? You weren't getting enough data back and you needed more, or you made it easier to read, or what was the thought process there?
I'm a data junkie. And so I noticed that with a lot of my clients that I was helping with, troubleshooting email deliverability problems, it was very frustrating with, some folks where, they're under an agency, but maybe the agency owner has their Mailgun account in their own account. So I don't have access to the agency level Mailgun account. I need that data. So there's a lot of red tape, I had to work, it took forever to kind of get everything that I needed. And so I was like, can I do something around this to give folks that data already inherently under their location account? Well, that's when I thought, well, I can take advantage of this and build it. And so that's why I decided to come out with my own dashboard. And the way this works, it's actually built for Mailgun. I've got it available for SendGrid and Postmark, all in the same price model. So once you buy this solution, if you did, then you would get access to all three of those dashboards and any others that I decide to come out with in the future. But it was primarily built for that frustration with Mailgun users, because the more data that we have, more easily accessible, the better, and we can derive out a solution much more quicker. And so that's kind of what happened with this idea with the dashboard. So I'd love to show you.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's see here. So this one is in one of my my playground accounts. So this one right here. So basically it lives in inside of your location. So it has an agency owner. This is not available for just, standard sub account owners. This is from an agency level. So agency level or agency owners are the ones that would want to purchase this. So you grab a license and you can use it for any number of sub accounts. There's no limitation to it, which is the cool thing. So you can grant everyone under your agency access to this tool. So basically what's going to happen, it's going to show you the domain that you're sending from at the very top. It's going to show you your contact trends. So it's going to show you the number of contacts that you've got, how many contacts added, and how many contacts have been unsubscribed with the date selector here, depending on what you have selected. So that's the first thing. The next thing it's going to show you is that there's another filter over here. I had to separate these two out just because there's no inherent date filter with extracting contacts from high level. So we had to implement this date function in two separate formats here. But this date filter is specific to the email metrics that we're going to get into next. And so this is going to default to the previous 30 days. And so again, this is built for this one that we're looking at is Mailgun. We're going to see how many messages have been sent out, how many were maybe of those number of emails, how many folks have responded back. This is what we get has posted via routes. That's whenever Mailgun receives an email from the outside coming in. How many were actually dropped, and then the percentage of how many were suppressed. And in case you're ever curious as to what any of these are, you can hover over these tooltip items to kind of give you that information. Then we got, different people like to see things in different ways. So there's this interactive graph. By default, it's showing you everything in red, which is delivered. But if you wanted to see something else, you can unselect the delivered, and you can see how many items have been suppressed, failed, or posted. You can kind of get rid of all of these. So it's very interactive. So for high volume senders, this is really cool, and a lot of people like that for that fact. And then my eyes always go over to these spinners, because this is where you get a lot of the real good information rather quickly. So you're looking at the delivered percentage. So we always want this to be at or above 97%. And I give you that information down here, kind of in a paragraph to kind of give you what to aim for. And the colors inside of these spinners are dynamic, meaning that if everything is good, then it's going to show in green. However, if it's red, then that means that you need to put focus on it and see what you can do to kind of improve it. So we got standard open event, clicked event, percentage here, the bounces, spam complaints, unsubscribes, and your reply rate, which, inherently Mailgun does not give you that percentage, but I'm able to calculate and kind of give that to you through the posted via routes function. And then at the very bottom, not that I've got anything here, but just like in Mailgun, you've got the suppressions table. Well, this is being pulled directly out of Mailgun for your domain specifically, and it's going to show your bounces, your complaints, your unsubscribes, and if you have any whitelists. And then you might have noticed this section. So notice that we spoke about the two IPs that are given to your account whenever you build it initially, or even if you have a dedicated IP, whatever the case may be, it's going to show you the exact IPs that are a part of your account. You can manually go into Mailgun and scope through all of the logs and read through it all and finally figure it out. But I give this to you instantly. And then you can always go to Cisco Talos. So what's going to happen here is that it's going to take you to Cisco Talos, and it's going to give you a representation based upon the way Cisco Talos sees it. Now, Cisco Talos is an aggregator of data. So they're not an inbox provider, but they've got endpoints all over the globe. So they got a pretty good idea of how things stand. But just keep in mind, it's not directly from an inbox provider. That's why you would want to go with GPT. So the reputation of that IP is good from what it sees. We don't have any significant level of spam, which is ideally what we want. We want this to always say none. And then those block lists, the most relevant ones are SpamCop, AbuseAt, and SpamHoss. There's two different versions of this. And then the last one being Barracuda, but Barracuda is not on here because they're Cisco and Barracuda are competitors. But if you're listed on any of these lists, then you will have problems reaching the inbox. So work with Mailgun, let them know what's going on, and they will rotate the IPs out. So that's very critical.
Cool.
And then click tracking. So I teach people how to use UTM parameters. So if you want to track how many times a link was clicked within a campaign, You can build a UTM framework, which is in my course within my membership portal. You can see what the campaign name is, the URL that was clicked, and then how many clicks were out of that campaign. So this is all really relevant information, and it's very crucial to have those holistic stats for your email sends.
Mm-hmm. And again, this is for folks who want to run their own mailgun, right? Because a lot of these stats are, if you're in Lead Connector, are baked in.
Yeah, exactly. So this is for your own Mailgun account. So let's say that you're the agency owner and you've got a sub account that wants to use their own Mailgun account. Well, you can still use this in that fashion. It's very easy. I show you everything to do. So you can still do that. If you're using LC email, I'm trying to work with Robin and Sean with giving me access to pull those stats in. So we've not ironed those details out yet, but that's still on the playbook. So we're hoping that we can manage to get that out and make that a part of the dashboard as well. But
Cool.
Right now, this is just for standalone Mailgun, SendGrid, and Postmark, which I can show you SendGrid. The data is going to look very similar, but depending on the API, there's different data in different platforms. So this looks really similar, but there's going to be a lot more data that you can extract, or a little less data that you can extract depending on the platform. But holistically, it's going to be kind of the same game. So that's with SendGrid. And then this, of course, would be with Postmark.
Cool.
Yeah. So right in the high level application.
Looks great.
Thank you.
So let me ask you, of all the folks that you help, when people come to you and say, I've got a problem.
Yep.
The majority of them have a problem at what level?
Well, a lot of them, they come to me and say, well, I get them kind of all over the spectrum. A lot of folks where they're high volume senders, they're sending, close to 1 million emails or maybe more a month. Those are true high volume senders, and they're using high level or even some other application. But so that kind of depends. With those guys, they just want to make sure that everything is set up correctly. Should they get a dedicated IP for the number of sends that they're sending? If they're at 1 million or more, then they should definitely have a dedicated. But in a lot of cases, sometimes they don't always. And so they want to go through the proper channels of getting all of that solidified and making sure that the reputation continues on after these changes are inherently made. So with those folks, there's a strategic warm-up process that you would want to go through, more on the lines of warming up the dedicated IP more than the domain, because the IP is what reigns king in the very beginning. So we want to make sure that is solidified. But then others are, coming to me and they're, maybe they're maxing out at maybe, 2,500 emails a month, but their emails aren't landing. So it's kind of all over the spectrum. But what I do is I go in and do a complete audit. I look at their infrastructure first. I go in and look at their campaigns, the copy that's in their campaigns. I figure out what's going on. I make any corrections where I can, and I give them a strategy that they can use going forward to continue with their email deliverability to make it go in the right direction. So there's always a strategy involved as well, which I give folks information to.
Cool. Got it. And that makes sense. So you're saying it's not just people that have problems. Oftentimes it's actually people who are doing pretty good, and they just want to make sure they're not leaving anything on the table.
Exactly. Email is
Very
super
cool.
important. Lots to know about.
Super
for sure.
important, especially for folks who are doing it in larger, numbers, for sure.
Yeah.
I could see wanting to just, hey, let's just get a second opinion here and make sure that we are, just not missing any low-hanging fruit, with something that could be taken care of with like a small tweak from somebody like Matt, who knows what they're doing. So Matt, this has been great. Your dashboard looks awesome. If people are having problems, or if they do want to get an audit just to make sure that they're not leaving anything on the table, where should they head?
Yeah, the best way to get in touch with me, just go to funneltechie.com/schedule. That's funneltechie.com/schedule. And that's my calendar. Just book an appointment and we'll kind of just talk it through, just so that I know the lay of the land. And I'll point you, I've got packages. So I'll point you to the right package that's best for you.
Very cool. That sounds great. And it's cool to hear that you work with helping people warm up dedicated IPs, because I feel like that's always been this mysterious thing of people really unsure of whether or not they should get one. And if they do get one, what do they do from there? So that sounds like an interesting service as well. Well, Matt, I could geek out on this forever. We've already hit an hour, so I'm going to let you go. But thank you so much for coming on to share all these tips and tricks for us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been the blast.
Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you in the next one.